I'm laughing because I'm thinking now I know why Jesus Revolution left you hanging dry, man.
Not enough jizz, basically.
There just wasn't enough.
Need more blood and jizz in my movie.
That's it.
Wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be.
Hello and welcome. My name is James, joined as ever by my friend Steve. And this episode, we are talking Brandon Cronenberg's Infinity Pool.
Hey, but you know the drill. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And just as a reminder, we do spoilers here, so you've been warned. James, let's talk Infinity Pool.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I was interested to see this. I've been a bit of a fan of Brandon Cronenberg. He's obviously the son of David Cronenberg, and I'm a massive, massive David Cronenberg fan. And Brandon Cronenberg has now directed 3 movies. He did Antiviral, Possessor from a couple of years ago, and now this one. And he seems to be doing that rare thing. And the only person I can think of that's also doing it is Joe Hill, the author, which is the son doing exactly the same thing as what their dad did. And actually being arguably just as good at it. Joe Hill is Stephen King's son. And,
right.
You'd think if you wanted to be a writer and you're Stephen King's son, the last thing you would do is become a horror writer. But that's exactly what he did. And he's pretty decent at it as well. And some of his stuff has been adapted into movies like The Black Phone last year was from a Joe Hill novel. And so far, so good. Brandon Cronenberg is doing exactly the kind of movie that I could have seen David Cronenberg doing. These are essentially sort of body horror movies. They're movies that question sort of our identity and the limits of our vessel and how that can be sort of manipulated and abused, but in ways that aren't wholly obvious. So I was pleased to see this one, and I think this one it starts off incredibly promisingly.
Yeah, I don't appreciate body horror at the same level that you do, James. I'm not a bones and all kind of guy. It's just not my. I'm a Jesus Revolution kind of guy. Just give me hippies on the beach. It's peace, love, war.
Can I give you pieces of hippies on the beach? But
pieces. Yeah, so I'm probably not going to approach this with the same admiration that you do. There's elements in this film I did like. I love the idea of taking not a popular writer, but a writer who wrote something a long time ago, and it got a little bit of traction and then never went anywhere with it, and is kind of having this existential crisis about his place, whether he's really creative, whether I can really stand on my own. He's got a sugar mommy wife who's got the real money.
Mm-hmm.
And so the element, to me, there's 2 elements at play here: the existential crisis the artist is having, and kind of the pot shots at the rich that we've already seen from previous films over the last year, like The Menu and Triangle of Sadness. There seems to be, in and amidst this exploration of body horror, as I'm sure you're going to get to in just a moment, those are the 2 elements that I appreciated. The kind of taking on the dog-eat-dog world of the rich, and the existential crisis of a writer wondering if he has anything to give.
What I was interested in this one is that it wasn't just that he was taking pot shots at the rich, but it seemed to me, I was getting triggered ever so slightly because it feels like he's attacking sort of expats and expat culture.
Yeah.
Very, very sort of specifically, that you can see echoes in some of these characters to people that I know and experiences that I've, dare I say, even had.
I was living just going to say, I think this is just a movie about the British in Europe at spring break.
Well, yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, it could be about American high schoolers and plowing down to Tijuana every spring break, or going into Europe, but definitely, as sort of expats living in Hong Kong for a long period of time, you realize that there is this kind of not so much sort of special treatment that happens, but you can kind of sort of sidestep a lot of there is an attitude that feels, and that where you think that you can kind of, you're kind of above the law, you can tiptoe through walk between the raindrops kind of thing, and that the laws of the land don't necessarily apply to you. Just to lay out the bare bones of the plot of this one, Alexander Skarsgård plays James Foster, who is, as we sort of said, he had a hit novel about 6-7 years ago, and is struggling to follow it up with anything. He has married well, a rich heiress, and they are holidaying in an unspecified third world country at a resort that is literally kind of holds them prisoner. It's a compound where behind high fences and barbed wire and gates and armed guards and what have you, they can enjoy this very sort of luxurious and affluent break. I believe it was all shot in Croatia, but it's pretty vague, deliberately vague about where it's supposed to be. I mean, they mention the country, but I think it's actually sort of a made-up country. He meets some other wealthy holidayers, vacationers there, not least Mia Goth's character Gabby and her husband, who's an architect, and their friends, and they invite them on a night out. You know, one of the guards has lent them his car, and they can leave the compound, something that they are not allowed to do, and apparently legally they are not allowed to do. You know, they're really not supposed to leave the compound at all for any reason. And they go out, they have a good time, and then as they're driving back, James, who is behind the wheel, hits someone with the car and kills them instantly, and they do a runner. They go back to the hotel. Next morning, police are on the door, and they get arrested. Now at that point you're like, oh, okay, I know where this is going. You know, there are a lot of movies that kind of feed into this kind of xenophobia, if you like, that if you go anywhere outside of your comfort zone and you have to deal with the authorities or the police, then it's all going to end horribly. They're going to abuse you, they're going to extort and blackmail you, and you know, you might die. And there's this horrible fear in a lot of these kind of movies for just being in a country other than your own. Eli Roth, you're familiar with Eli Roth? He made a lot of movies like this. Like Hostel is the big one, you know, where it's like rich businessmen go to some East European hellhole where they pay good money to torture and murder people just for fun. He made some movies down in South America as well, like Aftershock, which is a sort of earthquake disaster movie that gets very, very grisly and gruesome, and The Green Inferno, which is a full-blown cannibal movie where backpackers get eaten alive in the rainforest.
Well, I thought this movie also had shades of Westworld in it, because you have essentially, I was thinking of the line from Westworld when they're trying to decide if they should improve the robots at the resort, and the one scientist says, we don't have to spend time and money improving these robots, because at the end of the day, our guests only want to do two things. They want to shoot something and they want to thing. And that's really what this movie's about.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's a fascinating concept. You know, once he's been arrested, the chief of police, played by Thomas Kretschmann, who's actually rather excellent, comes in and says, accordance with local custom, you've now killed somebody, and so to preserve the honor of the family, the eldest son of your victim now gets to murder you. That's the lay of the land. However, if you can pay this certain price, we have a special facility downstairs where we can literally create a double of you, a clone of you, and he can murder that instead, and you can go about your business, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. So he has the means. He does it, only to discover that this group of wealthy holiday makers have all been in this situation before. They've all done it before, and literally it's given them carte blanche to do whatever they want, because so long as they can pay their way out of it, they can do whatever. They have free reign of the territory, and they can do whatever they like. But when you have these clones of themselves also in the mix, it opens the door to all kinds of other slightly sort of more abstract concepts involving sort of fractured identity and what have you, that goes down a very, and that's the very particularly Cronenbergian path that the film goes down.
I know I'm jumping ahead here, but the final scene where they're all going back to the airport, and this group that has just been totally libertine for the last hour and a half, just shooting, orgies, gratuitous violence, sex, just there's no limits to what they'll do and the depth that they'll plunge. And then as they're on the bus back to the airport, it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna have to get back to work and deal with the fence. You know, there's all these like everyday things, and what you meant, like you mentioned, the fractured nature of their identities. They have totally compartmentalized their worlds and their lives and their souls and their spirits into, I have suburban boring life, but once a year I get to go down to this third world country that can make clones, and I get to act out every vile impulse that I have within me.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I started to find the film slightly frustrating, because it gets this point and you're like, oh, the possibilities of this are endless. But then it decides to take some sort of make some less interesting decisions than I think perhaps it could. Because, I mean, it's that moment after that he's been through this entire rigmarole for the first time that I think it's Mia Goth's character poses to him. He's like, they put this kernel of doubt in his head where they say, how do you know that it's you who has survived and that you're not the clone? And then they never really go down that path any further. And I was like, oh, that's where it's going to get interesting, where he starts doubting whether, it gets very Blade Runner-esque. It's like, am I real or am I a robot, or what am I?
Well,
but it never really pursues that.
And I had the same exact thoughts. I thought that was one of the reasons he was keeping the black vases, and they were going to play a part later as some kind of restoration of his psyche, that whatever it was. But like you said, it's an avenue that they opened up that possibility, but they never explored it.
Yeah, I mean the urns of the ashes that he is handed every time that they kill and cremate one of his clients, it merely just becomes a kind of visual motif signifying how many times he might have done this. But it never really amounts to anything more than that. And the antics that they get up to are very sort of disappointingly ordinary. It's like, yeah, we're just going to go and drink as much as we want and fuck as much as we want, and have orgies and be sort of carefree, rather than actually go out of their way to do anything particularly creative or evil.
And that was some of my disappointment as well. When the Mia Goth character first kind of hijacks Alexander Skarsgård character on the side and starts servicing him, you can convey that. I don't have to see his jizz hitting the ground.
Beautiful moment.
I'm not suggesting every film I watch needs to be Sundance, but I prefer it to not be Pornhub. Like,
sure,
I don't need that in my. I mean, it's not a big deal, but I'm thinking this is where we start to take things that I think are just like ridiculous and try to portray them as artistic. And I'm just, I don't. You can convey I know what's happening here. I'm thinking the only time I've ever seen a dude's juice is in movies that.
Okay,
that's not what. Yeah.
I mean, actually, I didn't mind that scene because it happens early on. It's before he's had the hit and run, before he's got involved with the cops, and it's just early on in the evening where they have sort of broken free of the compound, and they're going off and having some fun. So for me, that really sort of seemed to foreshadow that, anything was possible and that this woman was going to be trouble. Yeah. And although she is very much kind of sort of the bait on the hook, if you like, of what gets him into trouble, she's not as dangerous as it suggests at the beginning. I mean, she's the one who's constantly shouting at him and goading him and seducing him. But I felt that that early scene where she was so carefree, so willing to essentially give him a hand job in front of both of their partners. And I was like, oh, well, who knows where this is going? Because, the idea of there being, a sort of sci-fi out of body element to it was still,
So are you suggesting, though, because you were kind of suggesting earlier that they really just kept it all very vanilla and plain. So were you kind of disappointed with that the foreshadowing wasn't kind of really acted upon at any great level?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I felt that the film doesn't get crazy enough. It sets up this incredibly promising scenario and setup. It's like where you essentially are given the keys to the kingdom. You can do whatever you want. There are no consequences. And what they end up doing isn't very, it's like it's no worse than what some high schoolers would do in Tijuana on spring break, essentially.
I'm just thinking, I'm laughing because I'm thinking now I know why Jesus Revolution left you hanging dry, man.
Not enough jizz, basically.
There just wasn't enough.
Need more blood and jizz in my movies.
That's it.
Because I knew what type of movie this was going to be going into it, because it is Brandon Cronenberg, because he's done Antiviral and he's done Possessor. Both of those films push the boundaries, in very imaginative ways. I mean, Antiviral is a movie about sort of obsessive fans who buy illnesses that their idols have had. So you could have not only COVID, but you could have Michelle Yeoh's COVID. You could get. It's about a company that takes samples. They go and visit celebrities when they're sick, and they take the samples, and then they sell those samples to fans. And Caleb Landry Jones plays a guy who works there, but he's also an addict. So there's a kind of obsessive fandom element of it, but there's a kind of drug addict element of it. But there's this body horror where they're having to mass produce it, and so they're creating just slabs of flesh, which is DNA similar to like Michelle Yeoh's flesh but it's not hers, so they don't have to, so they can mass produce this thing. It's very, very weird, and that's why I was hoping that this would go there. And
especially when we're talking cloning, and I thought some of the cloning sequences were quite interesting to watch, with his mouth pulled open, like who knows what's going to be.
And they're actually going to mold him.
Right, exactly. And of course they never do explain why this developing third world country has this
this tech,
cloning tech, but
I mean,
we'll just leave that as a...
It seems like the suggestion is that they're in some kind of sort of Cold War Soviet era bunker or something, But no, it makes no sense why it exists. But you're willing to. I was willing to sort of make that leap with them. But then the leap doesn't really go anywhere, and it's just, oh, okay, so you've got one as a sex slave, and it's like, okay, fine. They don't really do anything with it. They leave it merely as an opportunity to do what to have the keys to the kingdom, essentially, to have free reign of this island paradise. But I was like, but so what?
I think, and that's one of the reasons I was left a little bit underwhelmed with this film was I thought Alexander Skarsgård was a wonderful acting. I just thought the character was kind of boring and spineless. And I realized there's an element in the storyline where they're getting him up to the place where he's going to fight his feral self and kind of achieve some masculinity. But until they got there, he was just kind of this spineless guy who the sugar mama wife had far more brains, far more capability. This place is crazy. I'm out of here. And he's just like, okay, and I never quite got the impulsion why he even hung around. And then when he finally, kind of was going to make his break for the airport, he's just so easily taken down by a bunch of, only because he's so spineless and so insecure and so beta male, were they even able to do this to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, the suggestion is that, that Gabby seduced him by pretending to be a fan and having, lying and saying that she had read the book that nobody had read, that he wrote. It wasn't a huge hit. He had written this one book, and that he was so up himself, and that his ego was so starved that when he came across somebody who actually was quote unquote a fan, that he was more than happy just to kind of ignore everything and drop everything. But so for me, in the moment, that seemed like sufficient reason. And even when the wife goes, leaves him there essentially, because I thought that more was going to happen. I thought the relationship between him and Gabby was going to become more intertwined and more intense. Right. And it was going to become a far more sort of passionate thing. And although they do sort of sleep together, and there's a fairly graphic scene where her seducing him turns out to be an orgy with all of them involved while they're on this sort of hallucinogenic drug, that relationship didn't go where I was hoping that it would. And you're right, his character ends up just being completely sort of listless and directionless. To the point. I mean. Yeah. To its credit, I suppose, just thinking now, the one thing that might do is suggest that perhaps he is one of the clones. But, but the movie never comes down on one side of that or the other. And I don't think it leaves enough breadcrumbs to even make it legitimately ambiguous. But so I think I'm being a little bit generous there.
Yeah. I mean, I agreed with that. And the scene at the end after he kills his feral self, and she kind of bloodies her nipple, and he's suckling her. It's just one of those scenes where, what? Am I missing something? Help me out, James. You know these films. I'm just going.
These are your people. What are they on about?
Yeah, tell me how your people do this.
Well, no, I mean, I think for me, I think that was a somewhat unearned moment. I think it seemed to be more of a case of, oh, do this. This will look cool. This will be weird. This will be a bit gross. But it doesn't.
That's what it is. It
doesn't mean anything.
The scene which I mentioned earlier, I like weird when you can kind of connect the dots. When it's just like, let's just be weird for weird's sake, I'm just left kind of going, oh, it's too untethered. It's too umbilicaled for me. Because I'm always trying to think, yes, unumbilicaled. Because I'm trying to think, okay, the feralness, and I think, no, I can't connect this. I need to ask James, why did she put blood on her nipple, and why is he doing this?
I think unfortunately it was just an opportunity to stage a striking, kinky, taboo breaking image, but it's right at the end, and it doesn't really kind of mean anything to me. It didn't really resonate. At the end of the day, this was a movie that showed a lot of promise and set up a really interesting idea, but then ultimately didn't quite know where it wanted to take it. And I think you're left much like he is, sort of just sitting on a sun lounger in the rain at the end, not knowing quite what to do with yourself.
Yeah, I love the concept. Gated community, total resort on this side. Don't go beyond what is beyond those turrets and those barbed wire fencing and those big heavy gates. Is all kinds of shenanigans go on over there. I mean, I love that concept. Yeah,
this is Marwan, basically, isn't it? This is where you live. It's exactly like that.
That's it, man. And we do some crazy stuff here. It's I'm actually on my 4th version.
Excellent.
I got 4 urns, black urns on my cabinet.
Well, I hope it was worth it.
James, I'm going to go out on a limb here and just say, as an instrument of measurement, I think we should use black urns.
I think urns make sense. Absolutely.
How many black urns out of 5 are you going to give?
I want to throw this one to you first. I want to throw this to you.
Not to repeat myself, but as far as the kind of taking pot shots at the rich, I thought Triangle of Sadness and The Menu were far more enjoyable films. Again, I like the idea of the existential crisis of the artist. I'm a creative type myself, so I know what it's like to think, is anybody reading anything I wrote? Is anybody listening to anything? Is anybody watching our reviews? These kind of thoughts go through my mind, so I can identify with that character. Having said that, I'm not a big body horror fan. And although this film didn't get into elements of body horror, element like, say, Crimes of the Future or something like that, right, which his father did. I just found it underwhelming. A lot of dots didn't connect for me. And so in the end, I'm going to give this 2 black urns out of 5.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I felt it showed a lot of promise, but it didn't really land the plane, if you like. I did quite like sort of the setup. I quite liked the first half. I think there was the anticipation of where this was going, and it does, you have no idea that it's going to suddenly be about sort of cloning and about sort of this bacchanalian lifestyle. What do I mean?
The Marwanian lifestyle,
Sure. Who is it? The Epicureans who said, live for today, for tomorrow we die, or whatever. We die. Yeah. And I thought it was an interesting take of that, and I did really see sort of a parallel with sort of certain attitudes from the expat experience, where they just feel that, oh, okay, this is my playground. I don't really need to abide by the rules. I can kind of do what I want, which definitely bleeds into a lot of the movies that we've been talking about to do with the rich.
Well, you're British too, so you can identify with that element.
Oh, absolutely. There's obviously a colonial element to that as well. but it's not as good as his other films, I don't think. And it's amazing that it's not as good as his father's latest, and his dad's now in his 80s, I think, and is making edgier, more daring movies in the same year than his son, who is probably he's about my age, but he's probably in his 30s. I'm not sure. And that would bother me if I was Brandon Cronenberg and I saw Crimes of the Future. I'd be like, Jesus, Dad, that's far better than this, and weirder and edgier than the stuff that I'm making. So I did like it, and I liked it up to a point. But then but ultimately it didn't really satisfy. But that's not to say that what is there is without merit. So it's his weakest of the three films, I think. But it's still weird enough and edgy enough and bold enough that I think it merits some attention and some interest. And I think the performances are all good. And I'm glad that it leaves things relatively sort of unexplained. So I'm going to give it 3 black urns out of 5. But what I'm definitely going to do now is make sure that you watch Antiviral, which is the first Brandon Cronenberg movie, which I think that you would find really interesting.
Well, that's what we thought about Infinity Pool. What did you think? We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment in the boxes below. James, anything else you want to tell our legions of listeners out there?
No, just have you seen any of Brandon Cronenberg's other movies? Like me, do you think that he came in strong to begin with? Antiviral is still his best movie. How about David Cronenberg? Which is your favorite David Cronenberg movie? Any excuse to talk about one of those, and I happily will. Let us know, and check out some of our other videos as well. We've got over 100 videos now covering movies new and old on the channel, so please do check them.
You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be.